The Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell starts right now. Hey, Lawrence.
Jen, you know, on a special election night like this is the kind of night when you have a special House election like this, that I'd really like to talk to someone who really knows the inside of the Democrat Congressional Campaign Committee, where these kinds of campaigns are masterminded. You know anyone? I could talk to, like, right now, this second?
I know a few people, Lawrence. What should we talk about?
How about you? You used to work there back in the day. This was your job, getting these people elected in special elections and in general elections in November. So I'm asking you, when a district that was just last year, the Republican who then retired from the House, won by 22 points. A Democrat comes in and closes it to about 10 or so. We don't know yet, but somewhere in that range. What does that tell you is going to happen a year from now in November, given that there's more than 20 House seats that Republicans won by 10 points or less?
I mean, it tells you you can expand the map. And I was talking with Ken Martin about this earlier. They can look at a larger number of districts to potentially compete in. It also tells you that the Republicans are going to have to spend a lot of money in districts that they shouldn't have to spend money in, right? Because when you spend money in a district like Tennessee 7, you don't have money to spend in other districts where you want to win seats or you're trying to compete in very close seats. It also tells you that a lot of this is, I mean, the affordability message clearly worked very effectively. Afton Ben did that. She also talked about the Epstein files, and she put it all together. I know you've talked to Ro Khanna about this, as have I, about kind of the billionaires and the elite being disconnected from the country. So that's interesting, too. If you're running out there, if you're running the DCCC, I'd look at a couple of those things, expanding the map, where they're going to have to spend money, and kind of how the message worked in a district that's quite red.
You know, I've always admitted the one thing I really, really feel like I know nothing about is who's going to win the, House of Representatives elections. And it's so complex, and predicting it is so complex. And I can never forget the election where the Republicans won back the House of Representatives for the first time in 40 years. And exactly no one predicted it. No one predicted it. And the Democrats had a huge margin in the House in those days. And that's when Newt Gingrich found himself in the speakership when the Republicans won it for the first time. And when you live through that with no one predicting it, I've just lived with the complexity of it. But tonight does seem, even to me, pretty clarifying about what to look for in November and what happens to a party the next day in the House of Representatives after a special election like this, when it goes very badly for them and you've got a bunch of members who won their seats by these narrow margins. What do they have to say the next day when everyone gets together?
Well, I suspect, and we've seen a lot of this reporting already, even before this special election, that a lot of these Republicans are going to say, do I really want to keep being a part of this? You know, they've said they feel disrespected by Mike Johnson, disrespected by the White House. Do they want to potentially be in the minority? That's a question. And it's looking very much like the excitement and the energy and the electorate out there is for that. The other thing it made me think of, Lawrence, you've covered corruption so much, and there's plenty to cover about these days, is in 2006, you remember that cycle, the Democrats won back the House? We ran on the culture of corruption. That was a big part of the message. Right. It is massively more than that these days, and that still is something that resonates with people, no question.
Jen, so about that, you're at the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. You're trying to decide on what strategies will help individual races around the country. You know, we have former Speaker Tip O'Neill with that legendary statement of all politics is local. But in 2006, inside the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committees, did you see that there was a national issue to run on in corruption? Was that something that you could tell was actually working or was going to work?
Well, remember, it was Tom DeLay. It was the era of Tom DeLay, right? Where there was tons of corruption going on. Also, privatization of Social Security was a huge issue back then as well. And that was an issue that Democratic leadership, but also people across the country were talking about, because it was something that resonated and really connected with people. And I suspect healthcare, the cost of healthcare, these subsidies, depending on what happens, is going to be a version of that, or it could be. But also the culture of corruption and just people, the rich and the wealthy and the elite, living by a different set of rules. It's all tied together. So you did look at it. You looked at how it impacted districts, and how candidates could talk about it in a way that resonated with people in their districts.
Jen, Afton Bain is speaking, so we're going to go live to Nashville, where a Democratic candidate, Afton Bain, is now addressing her crowd.
The Republicans made these districts to be uncompetitive. They wanted us to back down, and we did not back down. We showed up. Our campaign raised $2.8 million, outraising our opponent. And from everyday people, not the Billionaire Boys Club, not Trump's Billionaire Boys Club, but from nurses and teachers in Clarksville and Dixon and young people who donated $5 or $10 to get us over the finish line. We knocked on 70,000 doors. We made over 185,000 calls. We had conversations on porches and churches and gas stations. We recruited 1,500 volunteers and ran one of the largest one-day canvases in the entire state that the state has seen in years, proving that when you speak with people with dignity and respect, they show up. And nobody in Washington believed we could get even this close. This was a 22-point race. They created these districts to be uncompetitive, but they don't understand Tennessee. They don't understand the South. They don't understand our stubborn hope of people who have been underestimated for decades. But you all understood it. You carried hope, and because of you, you put them on the run in a district they thought they could buy easy double digits, and we showed them that is not the case. And this campaign was rooted in something that's deeper than politics. We ran on an idea that government should work for working people. That families shouldn't be bankrupted by medical bills, that rural hospitals should stay open, and that healthcare costs shouldn't go up because someone in Washington wants a talking point. We ran on the belief that our story in Tennessee is bigger than the cynicism that has held this state hostage for decades. And tonight, because I believe in Southern hospitality, I called the Congressman-elect, Matt Van Epps, and I had one question for him. What will define what happens next? Do not let the Affordable Care Act subsidies expire. Do not raise healthcare costs for working families in Tennessee. But this isn't the end of our story. It's not even close. Because what we have built here in this district, this grassroots movement, is part of something bigger that is happening across the South and is happening across this country. Because we are tired of people outside of this state telling us that the South is backwards, that it's hopeless, and it's destined to be ruled by the same powerful people again and again. The South is not silent because the South has something to say. At Tennessee, we are leading the way. We have inspired an entire country. They are with us tonight, and they are so proud. They are so proud of what we were able to do. And we may not have won tonight, but we changed the story of what's possible here. And we're not done. Not by a long shot. So tomorrow, we keep fighting. Tomorrow, we keep building. Tomorrow, we keep organizing. Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for believing in each other. And thank you for believing in a South that refuses to be quiet. This campaign proved that Tennessee is full of people who want to build something better, something that belongs to all of us. So tonight isn't the end. It is the beginning of a next chapter of Tennessee and American politics. One of possibility, one of power, and one of progress for the people that we love. So thank you. Let's keep going. We're not done. Not now. Not ever. Thank you.
That was Democrat Afton Bain giving her, well, concession speech that sounded like a victory speech in Nashville tonight in a special congressional election there in a congressional district that the Republicans won by 22 points last year. She is now trailing by 9 points in the tally of the votes so far tonight. And joining us now is Congressman Jamie Raskin. He's the top Democrat on the House Judiciary Committee. And Congressman Raskin, we just heard Afton Bain say, we changed the story of what's possible. What is the story that Republicans in the House will be telling each other tomorrow about what happened tonight?
Well, in public, they'll be claiming a big victory, but in private, they will be acknowledging that this is a very sharp setback for them in the South, where you've got a 22-point Trump advantage district that is now down to 8 or 9 points. That's a remarkable turnaround to have a 14-point Democratic pickup in this rural district where, Nashville was gerrymandered in order just to dilute it and overwhelm it. And suddenly they've seen that they've added huge Democratic pockets to all of these Republican districts. And you hear in Afton Bain the voice of a new interracial working class progressive populism. And she is a fighting new leader. And that's one of the great things to come out of this election is Afton Bain herself, because she's going to be a major force in Tennessee politics and politics throughout the South. But I think the other thing you're going to hear the Republicans talking about is whoa on all the gerrymandering, because unless you've got a district that's up 15, 20, 25 points, you're not going to be interested if you've got one of these 8 or 10 point districts giving 2 or 3 points away in order to try to gerrymander Democrats further into oblivion in the South, in Florida or, Georgia, North Carolina, you name it. That strategy may be exhausted at this point for them because of the Democratic mobilizing that's taking place across the country, from Tennessee to Virginia to Jersey to New York to California. So I view it in the context of the last month of Democratic victories. And although the Republican won this election, it's a huge breakthrough for us in Tennessee to have these kinds of numbers, not just at the district-wide level, but if you look at each of these counties, they all have seemed to move in a blue direction.
Congressman, I want to go back to what you just said about gerrymandering, because that had not occurred to me yet in looking at these results. This is so important, and I want to let the audience hear the slow version of this to outline what it means. Because when you get into redistricting or gerrymandering from a party perspective, and you look at a state like Tennessee or Florida or Texas, and you say, we want to carve up the districts in a way that will allow us to pick up more Republican seats. What you have to do that is take some Republican voters out of the district they're in and redistribute those voters to another district. And so you first of all turn to the Republicans in your state delegation who win by giant margins, who win by, 18, 22, or win by 12. And you say to them, in effect, you don't need to win by 12. You can win by 8. You can win by 7. It'll be fine. We're going to shave off 3 or 4% of your Republican vote from your district and move it over here. And those Republicans, you're saying, are immediately saying to the people who want to do that, no. I need my 15-point margin. I need my 12-point margin. I need my 22-point margin, which is the lesson of tonight. I need my 22-point margin in order to continue to win this district. So no, you cannot redistrict this way.
And every politician knows his or her district better than anything else in the world, right? And a lot of politicians don't even like to give up points if they're in a 22% advantage district. but and that can be kind of irrational, but it's ineradicable in human nature. But after these results that we saw in Virginia and Jersey and Georgia and Tennessee tonight, somebody rationally can say, I'm only in a 10-point Republican advantage district. I know you want to squeeze out more Republican districts, but not at my expense, not if you're taking 2 or 3 points away from me. I'm not going for that. So let's hope that that can help to put up a big stop sign for what they're still trying to do across the country. I mean, another current that has really shaken them up a lot is the fact that whatever gains they thought they were making in the Latino community seemed to be dramatically eroded by the assault on our communities in the anti-immigration offensive by Trump. So 2 of the 5 districts that they wanted to try to steal in Texas belong to Democratic Latino leaders, Vicente Gonzalez and Henry Cuellar, both of whom are in fighting positive condition, and especially again after tonight, because it shows that the South is far from a foregone cause. But what they do have going for them on their side is the gerrymandering. And the other thing they've got going for them is the Supreme Court. And the other shoe has not dropped yet in the Calais case, where the Supreme Court can conceivably dismantle Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act the way that it dismembered Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And if that happens, that means they could be targeting the lone majority African-American district in Mississippi. For example, Benny Thompson's district, they could just, cut that one in half. There are more than a dozen districts like that where they might say, well, we're no longer bound by the so-called non-retrogression principle, which is you can't turn the clock back. They will take it as a license to turn the clock back. And then, it's something like the end of Reconstruction, and we're going to be in huge political upheaval across the country if they do it. But let's hope that tonight's result really puts the brakes on their extreme gerrymandering across the country.
Congressman Jamie Raskin, thank you very much for starting off our coverage tonight.
You bet.
Thank you. And coming up, Congressman Robert Garcia, who could be the next Oversight Committee chairman if this electoral trend continues, will join us next.
And we may not have won tonight, but we changed the story of what's possible here. And we're not done. Not by a long shot. So tomorrow, we keep fighting. Tomorrow, we keep building. Tomorrow, we keep organizing.
And joining us now in our special election coverage tonight is Democratic Congressman Robert Garcia of California. He's the top Democrat on the House Oversight Committee, and if this electoral trend continues, will be the chairman of that committee in the next Congress. A 22-point district for Republicans on a normal night, and tonight she's coming within 9 points or so. What does it tell you? What does it tell the Democrats about how they should be running their campaigns in November for the House?
Well, look, I think that Donald Trump and House Republicans better watch out, because I think right now the country is onto what they're doing. The country is onto their grift. The country is onto the fact that they have betrayed their own voters. And the result tonight, but also the result that just happened last month with the governor races, with what happened in California, in my home state, with Proposition 50, all signs.
The redistricting proposition.
The redistricting measure. I mean, all signs point to a really strong 2026 for Democrats in the House, but also possibly in the Senate. So we're feeling really good, but we got to keep focused on affordability, on healthcare, and on taking on government corruption.
And so on that last one of government corruption, is that where the Epstein files fits in? Because the Epstein files were in this campaign, somewhat to my surprise, because the way I've been covering it here, the way you've been covering it with us here, is as an investigation, an ongoing investigation about what's really happening with this material, what we should have in this material. I have not brought to it any kind of electoral framing. I have not considered what does this do in campaigns. But Afton Bain was using it, and using it to link the Epstein files to the message that these people, these Republicans, are not for us. They're for protecting other people. And she used the Epstein files as part of that message.
I mean, that's exactly right. And you're going to see candidates across the country run on corruption and talk about the Epstein files. Why is the president guarding, safeguarding, obsessed about these files that clearly have and protect very powerful and wealthy men that have done horrific things to girls and children and women, including rape and trafficking? And so to connect corruption to what Donald Trump is doing with the Epstein files is absolutely the right approach. And you're going to see us run on taking on government corruption. Donald Trump is the most corrupt person to ever be president of the United States.
Yeah, I mean, normally the investigative part of Congress's work doesn't normally find its way into campaigns. It's just a harder thing to wrap into campaigns for people who are concerned about things like cost of living, affordability, all of those issues. But so where did you learn something? Did Democrats learn something about how the Epstein files might fit in some, maybe not all, but in some congressional campaigns?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, look, the result tonight, to shrink that margin and to shrink the advantage that Republicans had in this election is huge. And it's a huge victory on top of the victories that we just had a month ago. And I think what you're going to see across the country is folks talking about not just affordability and health care, but about taking on Donald Trump and his grift, the grift of his family, of him enriching themselves, the largest corporations. And in the center of that is Donald Trump's flip-flop on the Epstein files. I mean, people see it. When I'm back home, I'm in the barber chair or I'm at the supermarket, people are stopping me and oftentimes not asking me about the cost of groceries. They're asking me about how are we going to hold the men in the Epstein files accountable for the damage that they have done to other people and women.
Marjorie Taylor Greene, who became one of your surprising allies in trying to obtain the Epstein files, resigning from Congress, and in her resignation statement, that's going to resign in January, said, I don't want to run for re-election to be elected into the minority. She has concluded that you are going to win the majority next year, and she didn't want to, among other things, just didn't want to go to work in the minority in that building.
Look, if we continue telling the story of supporting working class people, if we focus on taking on billionaires in this country, we focus on taking on the corruption of Donald Trump and his family, we are going to win the election next year. We're going to ensure that we're actually able to move an agenda forward, but it's going to take work. And I tell people all the time, look, celebrate these wins, celebrate tonight, celebrate what we did last month, but the work and the organizing has to continue all the way through the election.
So we heard from Afton Bain about her call conceding the race to the Republican candidate, and it sounded like an unusual call because normally that's a quick, polite, congratulations, good night. She says that she talked to him about extending subsidies for the Affordable Care Act, that she insisted with him in the concession call tonight that he's got to go to Washington and do that.
I look, and that's absolutely the right approach. I mean, right now, and I'm talking to Republicans and colleagues of mine, of course, in Congress, and they are scared. They are scared about their inaction. They're scared about the speaker. They're now more scared about Donald Trump and him losing his popularity across the country. And I would add a large part of that is also because of the Epstein files. And so we, I think, are at a place right now where people need to understand that we're all in this fight. The ACA protection, extending those subsidies right now is our top priority in the Congress. We have to get this done. The idea that healthcare costs are going to skyrocket for millions of Americans because Donald Trump would rather give tax breaks to billionaires, that's not what the American public want, and certainly not what Donald Trump campaigned on.
Does Donald Trump have anything to fear in you becoming the chair of the House Oversight Committee after the next election?
I'm going to be his worst nightmare, and the committee is going to hold him accountable every single day. We're not going to allow one of his crimes, his illegal actions, those of his administration, whether it's Pam Bondi, whether it's Stephen Miller. These are folks that have caused massive harm to the public, that are violating the Constitution, that are denying people's due process rights. And Donald Trump has to be held accountable for what he's done to this country. And this idea that we're going to just forget about it or pass it along as it's some sort of dark moment in history, we have to be very clear to the next generation that this is not how government should operate, and this is not how a president should act.
Congressman Robert Garcia, and if this year's electoral pattern holds, future Chairman Robert Garcia, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. And coming up, Pete Hegseth, is changing his story. He's on story number 3 now, and Donald Trump is doing the same thing that he always does when he's in trouble. That's next. The most incompetent and unqualified Secretary of Defense in history, the only one who had to pledge to stop drinking in order to win Senate confirmation, keeps changing his story. And we don't know if he stopped drinking. When publicly suspected of murder, changing your story is cause for increasing suspicion of guilt. And when your changed story is worse than your first false account, then your story cannot survive a real investigation. And now Pete Hegseth's story hinges on a new lie, the fog of war. He's claiming the fog of war, but you cannot have the fog of war without a war. And Pete Hegseth does not have a war. Pete Hegseth has gone from saying he could see very clearly what was happening when he authorized the killing of 11 people in a small boat running on outboard motors that posed absolutely no threat to the United States of America in any way, a boat that was about 1,200 miles away from the nearest point in the United States of America. He's now claiming that he couldn't see what was going on that boat because of the fog of war. Vietnam combat veterans can tell you about the fog of war. They can tell you about not knowing which direction the gunfire was coming from when it was killing their teammates. Soldiers in real combat situations in any war can tell you about the fog of war, but there is no fog in Pentagon offices where Pete Hegseth was watching that boat. And there is no fog in that video that we have seen of that small boat destroyed by an American missile under Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth's authority and under their orders. Here is Republican Senator Rand Paul's summary of Pete Hegseth's personal fog of war.
There's a very distinct statement was said on Sunday. Secretary Hegseth said he had no knowledge of this and it did not happen. It was fake news. It didn't happen. And then the next day from the podium of the White House, they're saying it did happen. So either he was lying to us on Sunday or he's incompetent and didn't know it had happened.
Senator Paul knows that he doesn't have to choose between lying and incompetent. Pete Hegseth has proved he's capable of both. George Will is the dean of conservative political writers in this country and the best prose stylist of all of them. In his new Washington Post column, George Will says Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth seems to be a war criminal without a war. There was a time when George Will was the thought leader of the smartest Republicans in our government, but he has mostly given up hope of influencing Washington Republicans in the Trump era. And now, with the Washington Post reporting that Pete Hegseth authorized a second missile strike aimed at the wreckage of that small boat because there were still 2 people alive clinging to that wreckage. George Will wrote, "The killing of the survivors by this moral slum of an administration should nauseate Americans." The moral slum of the Trump administration. Donald Trump is doing what he always does when he's in trouble. He's pretending he doesn't know anything about it, except that he knows for sure that he was not involved in it. When Donald Trump was not closing his eyes and apparently nodding off in today's absurd reality show that he calls a cabinet meeting, Donald Trump insisted that he's the only president of the United States in history incapable of obtaining information about a military attack under his authority.
As far as the attack is concerned, I still haven't gotten a lot of information because I rely on Pete. But to me, it was an attack. It wasn't 1 strike, 2 strikes, 3 strikes. Somebody asked me a question about the second strike. I didn't know about the second strike. I didn't know anything about people. I wasn't involved in it. I knew they took out a boat. But I would say this, they had a strike. I hear the gentleman that was in charge of that is extraordinary. He's an extraordinary person. I'll let Pete speak about him. But Pete was satisfied. Pete didn't know about second attack having to do with 2 people.
Oh, so that's their new story today. Pete didn't know about the second attack. So Donald Trump, who says he hasn't gotten a lot of information about this, then gives you the crucial information which sounds like a new invention that Pete Hegseth didn't know about the second attack. Could have said that on Sunday, could have said that when the story broke. The attack occurred on September 2nd. And 91 days later, Donald Trump, the oblivious president of the United States, is trying to stay awake in the cabinet room and telling you he didn't know about the second attack until the Washington Post told him about it by printing their story that Pete Hegseth first lied about and said was totally false. Now Pete Hegseth has in effect confirmed every element of the Washington Post story, except that the second strike was his idea. The Washington Post reports Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth gave a spoken directive, according to two people with direct knowledge of the operation. The order was to kill everybody, one of them said. Today, Pete Hegseth came up with the new story that he had moved on to his next meeting before the second strike occurred.
I watched that first strike live. As you can imagine, at the Department of War, we got a lot of things to do. So I didn't stick around for the hour and 2 hours, whatever, where all the sensitive site exploitation digitally occurs. So I moved on to my next meeting. A couple of hours later, I learned that that commander had made which he had the complete authority to do. And by the way, Admiral Bradley made the correct decision to ultimately sink the boat and eliminate the threat. He sunk the boat, and eliminated the threat. And it was the right call. We have his back, and the American people are safer because narco-terrorists know you can't bring drugs through the water and eventually on land if necessary to the American people. We will eliminate that threat, and we're proud to do it.
So you didn't see any survivors, to be clear, after that first strike? Personally.
I did not personally see survivors, but I stand, because the thing was on fire. It was exploded in fire, smoke, you can't see anything, you got digital. This is called the fog of war.
That is not a foggy region of the Caribbean, and Pete Hegseth didn't mention that fog of war, when he first talked about it on September 3rd, the day after.
I watched it live. We knew exactly who was in that boat, we knew exactly what they were doing, and we knew exactly who they represented. And that was Tren de Aragua, a narco-terrorist organization designated by the United States, trying to poison our country with illicit drugs.
You can still see that boat after that strike that he was so proud of. There's nothing preventing you from seeing it. And that's what he said the day after the strike, when he was so proud to show that video of that murder. He's lying, of course. He's lying about who was in the boat. He can't give a single name of who was in the boat. He can't give a single age. He doesn't know if they were all men. He doesn't know if they were all adults. He doesn't know if there was a 12-year-old boy there, a 14-year-old. He has no idea. And he made sure that all the evidence of who was on that boat and what was on that boat was destroyed by his two missiles. They are evidence-destroying missiles, used in the commission of what appears to be a crime and then used for the cover-up. Use the missiles to make sure you destroy all the evidence. The Washington Post reports the protocols were changed after the strike to emphasize rescuing suspected smugglers if they survived strikes, according to 3 people. It is unclear who directed the change in protocol and when exactly it took shape. The Pentagon's war manual clearly states the requirement to refuse to comply with orders to commit law of war violations applies to orders to perform conduct that is clearly illegal or orders that the subordinate knows, in fact, are illegal. For example, orders to fire upon the shipwrecked would be clearly illegal. And so firing on those 2 survivors was illegal when they did it. Why would you have to change a protocol so that it would comply with the Pentagon manual? Quote, orders to fire upon the shipwrecked would be clearly illegal. So there is no doubt, if the Washington Post reporting is true, that the firing of that second missile was illegal, according to the actual words of the Pentagon's own manual. There is now hope for real congressional investigations this year because the Democrats take over the House of Representatives next year, and that conduct will be investigated even further. But right now, the hope for congressional investigations this year depends on the Republican chairs of the House and Senate Armed Services Committees conducting those investigations. And this is what the Senate Republican Armed Services Committee Chairman Roger Wicker, said today.
Were there survivors who were killed in that second attack?
I don't have that information.
Do you worry?
But I do think we'll get that information, and we're certainly going to have available to us all of the audio and all of the video. And at that point, I'll be able to have a more informed conversation with the press.
Do you worry there'd be a war crime if the survivors were killed?
We're going to find out what the true facts are, and then there'll be a determination about that.
And today, the Washington Post reports that the White House's comments yesterday that it was Admiral Bradley who ordered the second strike, quote, elicited a furious backlash within the Defense Department, where officials described feeling angry at the uncertainty over whether Hegseth would take responsibility for his alleged role in the operation or leave the military and civilian staff under him to face the consequences. This is Protect Pete BS. One military official who, like others, spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss internal conversations, told the Post. Press Secretary Leavitt's statement left it up to interpretation who was responsible for the second strike that killed the two survivors, a separate military official said. One official said of Leavitt's statement, it's throwing us, the service members, under the bus. Another person said some of Hegseth's top civilian staff appeared deeply alarmed about the revelations and were contemplating whether to leave the administration. After this break, Senator Adam Schiff will join us. Former Fox legal analyst Andrew Napolitano said this about his friend Pete Hegseth today.
It gives me no pleasure to say what I'm about to say because I worked with Pete Hegseth for 7 or 8 years at Fox News. This is an act of a war crime, ordering survivors who the law requires be rescued instead to be murdered. There's absolutely no legal basis for it. Everybody along the line who did it, from the Secretary of Defense to the Admiral to the people who actually pulled the trigger, should be prosecuted for a war crime for killing these two people.
Joining us now is Democratic Senator Adam Schiff of California. He's a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Senator, thank you very much for joining us tonight. What is your legal view of the state of the evidence so far?
Well, I think it's important to remember that all of this campaign, this military campaign, is unlawful, unconstitutional. Congress has not authorized these actions. There's no imminent threat of invasion or attack from Venezuela. So all of this is unlawful. But if there was an order to deliberately kill these two survivors, that moves unlawful, unconstitutional into the realm of war crimes. And it was interesting watching that press conference with the president and Hegseth, where he appears to read carefully worded language along the lines of the Admiral took action to destroy the ship and eliminate the threat. And I think the reason he worded it that way, the reason probably lawyers told him to word it that way, is they want to, I think, try to distinguish, oh no, they weren't trying to kill the survivors, they were just trying to destroy the boat they were on. That's a very flimsy read, I think, to try to hang their hat on. If indeed Hegseth ordered for all these people to be killed, and the Admiral acted on that order, whether Hegseth was in the room or he wasn't in the room, and I think you're right to be entirely skeptical of any claim Hegseth makes about what he knew or didn't know. But if he gave the order to kill everyone, then he is responsible for the killing of those survivors and a potential war crime. I think the only way we get to the bottom of this is by analyzing the video, audio if it exists, but also having the Admiral testify and others who were present testify so that we can hear firsthand what did they see, what did they know, what were the orders, what action did they take.
Well, we just heard Roger Wicker, the Senate Armed Services Committee chairman, say in no uncertain terms that he and the committee are going to see every bit of video and they're going to hear every bit of audio. He's determined to get all of that evidence, and he does have the power to do that.
He certainly has the power to do it, and I hope that he will. I think he seems very serious about it, and I know Roger, I think he's determined. Will the administration provide it? Will they need to somehow subpoena it? Are they willing to go to the mat to fight the administration for that? Are they going to go beyond privately interviewing the admiral? Will they conduct a public hearing? Will they allow the public to see the video and audio so that it's not described to us by third parties? There's a lot of variation in what kind of oversight, how rigorous it can be. If it's going to enjoy the public confidence, I think it has to be done out in the open. And I hope on a bipartisan basis that they will persevere and insist on public hearings and public disclosure of all the evidence.
It does seem that we will eventually get there, either through the coming year's hearings in the House and the Senate in investigations, or when the Democrats control at least the House of Representatives, as they are likely to after next year's election, and then you will see unencumbered investigations of this sort of thing. And then, of course, there is the next presidency. If the next presidency has a Democratic administration with an attorney general chosen by a Democratic president, this is a criminal investigation that could be open on day one.
I think all that is very true, and it's part of the reason why Senator Kaine, myself, Rand Paul have introduced resolutions and may introduce yet another to make it clear that Congress is not authorizing these actions. These actions expose our service members to physical harm, but as we made the case the last time we brought up one of these War Powers resolution, it also exposes these service members to legal harm, to legal exposure, and now we see that so graphically with what's taken place. But yes, Lawrence, one way or another, one time or another, we will get to the bottom of this. I am concerned in the near term that the president saying he's closing off or trying to close off airspace above Venezuela, his more leaning into statements that we're going to strike land. This would be, another potential opportunity for Trump to push this issue of a potential war crime off the front and center and bring about a conflict with Venezuela to focus the country's attention on that instead. I'm not saying that's what he will do, but nevertheless, we have seen this president engage in reckless conduct as a way of distracting from his other problems.
Senator Adam Schiff, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Lawrence.
Thank you. And tonight's last word about Giving Tuesday is next. As most of you know, today is Giving Tuesday, and on Giving Tuesday, we always hope you'll remember the Kind Fund, the partnership I created with UNICEF to provide desks for schools in Malawi and scholarships for girls to attend high school in Malawi, where public high school is not free. You can contribute any amount at lastworddesks.ms.now. That is tonight's last word.